Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. And thank you so much to the Centre for Fiction, which is just this beautiful place. It used to be the Mercantile Library. It has a long and storied history, and is a great supporter of writers of fiction, especially fiction, which you can't say about many places. So it's lovely. I hear rumours it's going to move, which makes me sad. Is it going to move? Yeah. Oh. So we're especially lucky to be in this place while we can. You have the bios of everyone in front of you, so I'm not going to use up our time by going through all the prodigious accomplishments of the panel here. But just so you know who's who, this is Cara Hoffman, David Abrams, Dalia Sofer, and Matt Gallagher at the end. Two of us are veterans, the two blokes in this case, and we are all novelists. So I'm going to start by, could people turn off their phones if you haven't remembered? Thanks. Because I seem to have a cold and thus cannot think, I'm going to read and hope that it makes sense. And I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of imagination today and why I created this panel, and that will segue into an introduction to our discussion. My new novel, Wolf Season, comes out at a deeply disturbing time in history, when the leadership in our country and too many of its followers are suffering a serious crisis of compassion. This hit me particularly strongly last August, when I happened to be at an artist residency at the same time as white nationalists were holding their now infamous and deadly rally just down the road in Charlottesville. I and another writer went to counter-protest and to bear witness. As I watched the hate-filled faces around me, chanting Nazi and racist slogans, I realized that I was witnessing a colossal failure of imagination. These white nationalists had clearly never given a moment's thought to what it was like to be an African American or an immigrant, a Muslim or a Jew or anyone else they were targeting. On the contrary, they were invested in not thinking about these matters, the better to demonize the people they wished to hate. I thought about this because as a writer, my business is imagination. When I began researching Wolf Season, Iraqi refugees and women soldiers, I'd never met a soldier, never known an Iraqi, and never lived through a war. What enabled me to surmount these obstacles was reading, listening, thinking, and watching. I spent 3 years interviewing some 40 women who'd served in Iraq, as well as Iraqi refugees. But above all, I needed to use my imagination. And I don't mean the kind of imagination you use to invent characters and plots. I mean using my imagination to understand the experiences of soldiers and Iraqis in war well enough to put them in a novel. The use of imagination is the most precious gift fiction offers to both readers and writers, for it opens a door into worlds and lives we might otherwise never encounter. The very act of becoming absorbed in a book takes us out of ourselves and puts us in the skin of others. We don't merely sympathize with an Anna Karenina or a Jane Eyre, we become them. And we do this not by passively reading alone, but by hooking our imaginations to the characters and allowing them to lift us out of ourselves and plunge into the lives of others. This is how fiction teaches compassion, the very emotion that is missing in prejudice, let alone hatred. The racists I saw in Charlottesville, the anti-Semites, Nazis, and Islamophobes, were all refusing to use their imaginations. And when you won't use your imagination, you cannot feel anything for anyone but yourself. Much has happened in the world since I began working on Wolf Season. The civil war in Syria, the explosion of refugees around the world, the starvation and cholera in Yemen, I could go on and on. Even now, that man in the White House is sending more troops to the endless, unwinnable war in Afghanistan. And here too, I see a failure of imagination, for the voices of the victims of these wars continue to remain virtually unheard. Many among those Syrian refugees, for example, are in fact Iraqis who fled Syria to escape our war only to have to flee again. And yet, as responsible as we Americans are for what has happened in Iraq, very few American writers address the Iraqi point of view, and very few American publishers publish Iraqi writers. This is yet another failure of imagination on our part, a fear of going beyond what we know to explore what we think we don't. And where does this fear come from? I suspect from the assumption that a Muslim from the Middle East is so different from a Christian or a Jew in the States that we cannot hope to understand one another. I find this tragic. For if we used our imaginations, we could overcome this fear and recognize the myriad desires and needs, wishes and hopes we all have in common instead. I invited these particular writers to this panel today because they have all used their imaginations in just this way. Each has taken a clear-eyed look at what violence does to the human soul, and each is the kind of writer who writes not only from the heart, but from the conscience. Each one of us has approached this in a different way, and we have not all written about the same conflicts. But something we all have in common is that we've looked at violence not just as a political chess game or as a vehicle for entertainment, but through the lens of what such violence does to a person's heart, soul, body, and mind. And in doing so, we have all, in our different ways, tried to rip away the jingoism, blind patriotism, and glamorizing of violence that results in what Roy Scranton, another veteran novelist, calls war porn. In short, it is writers like these who bring the kind of honesty to their work that fosters compassion and dismantles hate. So I'm now going to turn to all of you, and each person's going to have their say, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we can talk among ourselves and open it up to you. Carrie?
Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Thank you. Thank you to the Center for Fiction, and thank you. It's really an honor, I think, for all of us to be here with Helen, who has paved the way for so many of us, writing about feminism and writing about war and writing about conflict. So thank you for inviting me. I want to say up front, I also wrote my notes, so I hope you'll forgive me for reading and not being so off the cuff. I want to say up front that I'm not a war writer. My novels cover diverse topics that have been informed by my work as a journalist and my upbringing in northern Appalachia and by my youth in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, where I worked illegally and was transient for many years. I write about outsiders, and I came to writing Be Safe, I Love You, which is my book about homecoming, a soldier's homecoming, because I had not seen a depiction of a woman soldier's homecoming, and I had not seen depictions of people who enlisted because they had no other options to make money. And to me, this seemed highly problematic, especially as my brother and all of my uncles joined the military and fought wars to pay the bills. So I'm interested in talking tonight about how the war novel has become its own kind of adventure genre. And these days, it seems the war novel is generally told by someone who has a higher rank, who is already in some manner involved with writing and literature. And you rarely see a narrative coming from people who make up the rank and file. And generally, this adventure story is about one soldier's transformation whereby he learns that war is a horror and murdering others is bad for you and your family and society and your culture. And it's often romantic, and it's depicting a disaffected, rugged individual, and it often shows great love between men. So the fact that there's no longer a draft means that this genre is flooded with stories written by those who thought it was a good idea to enlist, usually for ideological reasons. And plot-wise, I think they're pretty thin. So they go something like, I thought this was a good idea. It turned out to wreak havoc on my life and the lives of those of others. But I learned something deep about the nature of violence, and I bonded with people while I was committing and supporting acts of violence. And now, because of this paradox, I'm jaded or broken or racked with guilt. Or now I have valor or discipline or wisdom or a combination of all of these traits. So Sappho first deconstructed this story in 600 BCE. So that gives you an idea of how tired it is. Women's stories have long been excluded from this tradition of adventure fiction, and women have long been told they know nothing about war, even though they are overwhelmingly affected by it, and many have served alongside men throughout history. My question is, what qualifies a soldier? Someone who is deeply embedded in a process of propaganda and physical and mental control to talk or write about war. Why are stories of violence told by the perpetrators and supporters of violence thought to be more credible than stories told by civilians, victims of war, people who have lived in war zones, people who don't depict war as a personal catharsis or their own heart of darkness, people who talk frankly about PTSD? It seems clear that someone who has their home, their country, their culture destroyed by the military in various ways, from bombing or occupation or loss of family members or dealing with a family member's homecoming, which in and of itself might include violence and emotional distress, that person has an intimate knowledge of war and what it does personally, culturally, and socially. So why are those perspectives questioned? People who commit acts of violence, particularly state-sanctioned violence, are often invested in excusing their actions. I've read articles in which soldiers and former soldiers condemn the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but commend the acts of individuals fighting, saying that they would do it all over again if given the chance. This is the definition of doublethink, of psychological splitting, and it should give each of us pause. Men are thought to have experience with war, and women are thought to have experience with the domestic. But I would make the case that it's because of the domestic that women are deeply and intimately familiar with war. I do not mean this in the way you might think I don't mean, because women are left to raise children alone, or women are left to support a family alone or tend to a relative who is wounded or disabled, or because they're left without infrastructure and must figure out how to feed their family or go on in a country that doesn't have a power grid or plumbing. I mean this because women are left to figure out PTSD has become an issue in recent decades, and much has been done to increase funding and studies in order to understand the disorder because of returning soldiers. But civilian women overwhelmingly make up those who suffer from PTSD. Since 9/11, 6,800 American soldiers have been killed in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But between 3,000 and 4,000 American women are murdered by intimate partners every year. Nearly 80,000 since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. About 50,000 soldiers have been injured in those wars, but around 300,000 women are raped every year. So that's more than 4 million since 9/11. This violence is accompanied by economic and political sanction. Women were prevented for centuries from attaining education, from owning property, from having private bank accounts. They were prevented by law from voting until 1920, could not obtain their own credit cards until 1974, were told it was the natural order for them to do unpaid work at home, and when they worked outside the home, they would receive less pay. To this day, women are not represented with any parity in government, in finance, and academia, and even in the highest positions must maintain perpetual vigilance to avoid physical attacks and exploitation by people who hate them and who benefit from their lack of power. So my question is, what does that sound like? Because to me, it sounds like an occupation. And I don't think that there are many people here tonight who don't understand the toll that that occupation has taken on culture and family life and on politics. The stories of American soldiers protecting U.S. interests in foreign lands are a small fraction of the stories that constitute war, what war is. My hope for the future is that war writing will disappear entirely. And if that is impossible, then my hope is for an expansive canon that includes voices from all fronts.
Thank you, Cara.
David.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about, can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about craft, actually, in relation to my novel, Brave Deeds, which just came out in August. Brave Deeds takes place in Baghdad during Operation Iraqi Freedom and focuses on 6 soldiers, junior enlisted soldiers, whose beloved platoon sergeant is killed shortly before the action of the book begins. When they're told by their company commander that they can't attend his memorial service on the other side of Baghdad, on a forward operating base on the other side of Baghdad, which is scheduled to take place over there, they're told that they have to work that day. When their company commander tells them that, they decide to go AWOL, absent without leave. They leave their forward operating base without permission, just these 6 soldiers. They steal a Humvee, and they head out into the wilds of the city of Baghdad. And best laid plans of mice and men. Their Humvee breaks down shortly after they leave, and they're forced to continue their odyssey on foot. So that's the setup of the novel, which takes place over a course of about 8 hours or so. So what I want to talk about tonight specifically is the point of view. I took a little bit of a risk in the way I wrote this book. Early in the process of writing this novel, I decided to tell it from the first person plural point of view. That is, there is no one individual speaker's voice who is identified. The narrator is a member. The narrator is a member of a group that acts as a unit. In Brave Deeds, it's literally a unit. A squad comprised of the characters Arrow, Park, Drew, Fish, Cheever, and Alejandro. Matter of fact, the very first chapter is called We. And the first sentence is, we walk, we walk, we walk. So the 6 words, and half of them are we. Half of them are the first person plural point of view. That wasn't a deliberate choice, wasn't a deliberate craft choice of mine at first. But the very first sentence I wrote in the very first draft was, and I don't have that one memorized. 6 words are easy to memorize, but the other one's not so much. So the very first thing I wrote in this book, in the first draft, was, we double time across Baghdad on our 12 feet, a mutant dozen-legged beetle dashing from rock to rock, confident in its shell, but always careful of the soft belly beneath. And that felt right. The rhythm of that sentence felt right. So the very next sentence I wrote in that first draft was, we are 6 men moving single file along the alleys, the edges of roads, and the maze of beige buildings. Good enough. Third sentence I wrote in that first draft. We keep moving, ducking and dodging and cursing and sprinting. So I got in the rhythm of the we sentences, starting off. Not every single sentence in this book starts with we, just so you know. But I got in that rhythm, and from there I just kind of went with it, and I never looked back. As I wrote, I started to understand why I was writing from the we point of view. I realized that this would be a story about the collective voice of war, as embodied in 6 junior enlisted soldiers. It would be about the very nature of the military, which emphasizes above all teamwork, as Matt knows. We succeed or fail on how well we as soldiers work together. So I can remember my very first weeks in basic training, first days even in basic training way back in 1988 at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where camaraderie was literally drilled into our heads during basic training. We succeeded or we failed on how well we worked together. We were when we first arrived there, we were all strangers. We were looking at each other as strangers. We came from San Francisco, we came from Omaha, we came from Miami, from Hoboken. We had different temperaments, backgrounds, and belief systems, but yet we were all expected to pull together to make it through those weeks of basic training. We were punished together and we were praised together. And in the book, in the novel, likewise, there is no way that Arrow and the 5 others will make it across Baghdad to the memorial service, as I write, alive, intact, all 12 arms and legs still attached, unless they do it together. They must be the we, not the me. So using first person plural gave me a lot of freedom as a writer. I could kind of dip in and dip out of the characters' heads at will, and the flow of the narrative was elastic and flexible. I owed no allegiance to any one character or individual. To me, it was the group that mattered. That being said, individual identity doesn't go away in the course of brave deeds. Arrow, Park, Drew, O, or Alejandro, Cheever, and Fish are still unique and important, but self takes a secondary role to the collective whole, as it should when you are a soldier, enlisted, or officer in the Army. In the book, the we, who serves as sort of a seventh character, if you will, throughout the book, the we knows more than any one character. Each of the six knows a little bit about the other as best they can in their situation, but they don't know all. Cheever, for instance, has suicidal thoughts. O is distracted by letters from his wife back home, and Arrow is developing or has deeper feelings for Sergeant Morgan, the platoon sergeant who was killed. He has deeper feelings for Sergeant Morgan, an unexpected love that even he is not completely aware of why he has that. But the we narrator, flying overhead at like 30,000 feet, that we narrator can put all those pieces together, and that narrator, the we, knows everything about everybody. And that gives the voice of the novel more authority and a little less vulnerability than just a single narrator. So it's sort of like a Greek chorus, but a little more involved, as if the Greek chorus were Oedipus, Theseus, and all of the other characters in Oedipus Rex. So that's kind of what I just wanted to talk about, the collective whole and the unity of the book, of the narrator, and reflection of the military as a whole.
Thanks. Dalia?
Thanks. This is good? Okay, it's working. So I'll speak briefly on writing about conflict and writing in exile. And I should preface this by saying that my focus has been Iran, because that's where I'm from originally, and I left in 1982, some years after the revolution. As someone drawn to exploring conflict, I found that it can be depicted as discord between nations or among individuals, or as a clash of a nation with itself or of an individual with society. All of which, if rendered successfully, ultimately boils down to this: the conflict of each character within the narrative with him or herself. As Faulkner has said, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. To write about conflict, I try to reside in that fluid zone between opposing sides, so that each side is simultaneously victim and perpetrator, actor and subject. This isn't to say that there are no just behaviors or unjust actions. Rather, it makes the argument that humans are incapable of being entirely one or the other. A perpetrator can be a victim of history and of his own unbridled emotions. A victim can be a perpetrator toward other victims or even toward himself. I'd like to take a moment to focus on the depiction of conflict in and with Iran. In the popular imagination of the West, Iran is often perceived as a nation in conflict with others. This, of course, is part of the picture. But what is equally intriguing about Iran is its conflict with itself. Its Zoroastrian past versus its Islamic present, its fragmented history versus its desire for an uninterrupted and grand historiography, its resentment toward the meddling and domination of foreign powers versus recognition of its complicity with these powers, its desire to be a dominant but stabilizing political force versus its centuries-old distrust of its Sunni Arab neighbors, its recent rural past versus its present urbanization, its celebration of the Revolution of '79 versus its repeated attempts to temper and adjust the legacies of that revolution. Here I'll highlight two books that I think illustrate these ambiguities beautifully. The first is Thirst by Mahmoud Dowlatabadi, about the widely overlooked Iran-Iraq war that lasted 8 years and killed an estimated 1 million people. As the book opens, soldiers on opposing sides are battling for access to a water tank. Trapped in a stalemate, their options are grim. run for the water tank and risk getting shot by enemy fire, or stay in the trench and die of thirst. Soon we find that this scene is part of a fictional account being written by a nameless Iranian author. It's also being written across the border by an Iraqi journalist, perpetually interrupted by a government official pressuring him to deliver a fabricated propagandist report on a murder at a prison camp. The boundaries of the two stories keep blurring as other narratives also seep in: an interrogation in a military court, the lament of a martyr's widow, historical chronicles of bygone Iranian and Arab dynasties. By weaving in multiple voices, narratives, perspectives, and time periods, Dawlatabadi captures the fragmentation caused by conflict, the impossibility to tell a fixed story, and the chorus of interpretations crying out simultaneously and often in dissonance. In the end, each individual must decide how to resolve the conflict within himself. As one character says of a prisoner in his hold, "He made me furious, but I couldn't just kill him in cold blood. The sun had just risen, but the small of his back was bathed in sweat. Sweat poured from his brow and ran down his neck. Evidently there was still some water left in his body, even though the flasks in his trench were empty and his hip flask too. His eyes tormented me." The other book I'd like to mention is Remembering Akbar, an autobiographical novel by Behruz Qamari about a revolutionary who ends up in Evin prison along with other political prisoners. Dedicating each chapter to a prisoner, the book paints a multifaceted portrait of those who participated in a revolution that ended up annihilating them. But beyond that, it focuses on the spaces between the tragedies, friendships, moments of hilarity, pranks, and invariably boredom, not only among the prisoners, but also between the prisoners and their captors. And I'll finish with a few words about writing in exile. An exile, I think, is different from an immigrant in that he is not left by choice, but by force. This forced departure creates a displacement that goes beyond questions of cultural adaptation. It's a displacement in time and place. One is simultaneously living in the present and the past, and in alternate realities of what is and what could have been. Exile to me is a constant collision with an absence. And even when brought about by necessity, exile can be accompanied by shame. In a memoir of her grandfather, the renowned Parisian Jewish art dealer Paul Rosenberg, who fled France during the Nazi occupation, the French journalist Anne Sinclair writes, "Admitting that others stayed on in their homeland and actually risked and often paid for with their lives undoubtedly filled my grandfather with shame." Quoting historian Emmanuel Loyer, she continues, "The French tradition is characterized by a disparaging image of the exile, which places him somewhere between flight and treason. So too, I believe, is the experience of the Iranian exile, and writing from that vantage point, I must reside in that jagged space, using pain and shame to explore not only geographic exile, but also a larger sense of estrangement, which at its core is the human condition."
Thank you. Matt.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So part of being a veteran writer in 2017 America is after your book comes out, you go to kind of various colleges. For me, because I live here in New York, often along the East Coast, and you come speak to writing classes, to history classes, whomever will have you really, and it's good, and it's an opportunity to meet with young minds and discuss big issues, though inevitably, of course, these things have kind of a pet the veteran feel to it. After all, we do make up only less than 0.5% of the American population, which is a very small number and contrasts mightily with previous wars. What are kind of the ripple effects of that, right? Not just the amount of fewer people serving in this country and very specific places in this country tend to come from the South and the Midwest. That makes up the majority of our service members these days. But secondary and tertiary effect of that is there's less family members that have somebody serving. There's less people who have friends serving. Over the course of now 16 years of conflict, what does that mean? In these conversations with these college students, I've been finding as the years go by, they're still as intelligent as ever, they're still as sharp and as engaged as ever, but there's this kind of strange duality thing that's been happening, that they are more and more comfortable with their country constantly being at war someplace else, right? And every time turning on the news, because that is their normal. America has always been, since they've been politically engaged, has always been at war. Simultaneously, though, at least in my anecdotal experiences, very few of them have friends or family members serving. Right? In a way, the American soldier, to many of these young minds, is a different type of other. And that bothered me. That interested me. And it also brought me back to kind of when I was their age, which to my mind wasn't that long ago, though I'm sure they would disagree mightily with that. I was an 18-year-old freshman when 9/11 happened, and I joined the ROTC program mostly as a way to pay for school. My brother and I were the grandchildren of World War II veterans, but we were also the children of 2 Vietnam War protesters. So, like a lot of people of our micro generation, I think, we were kind of raised with this duality of having a healthy respect for military service, but also I think a healthy skepticism for when and where military force is applied. And that's complicated and it's messy, and big things should be complicated and messy, right? There were no easy answers at the dinner table when we had these conversations. And good, because easy answers are boring, and easy answers are aren't what I think intelligent people go out and search for. So 2001 happens. I decide not to be a JAG lawyer and decide instead to go serve as an armored cavalry officer. Like most thinking people, I had deep misgivings about the Iraq invasion, and ultimately decided to honor my commitment and go serve because I thought I was in a unique time and place to contribute for the better, to be in my small platoon, if this was going to happen, and it was going to happen with or without Cadet Gallagher, that maybe if Cadet Gallagher was there, some small betterment could occur. Spent 15 months in Iraq during the latter part of the surge in a sectarian town northwest of Baghdad. Kept a blog there until I made fun of my lieutenant colonel and he shut it down. That's a different story. It seems quaint now to say, but we came home thinking the war had been turned. I don't know if wars like Iraq can be won, but we came home thinking that some progress had occurred. And it really had. We were there. Schools were reopening. Violence was trending downward. Many mistakes were made during those 15 months, but two things that I was proud of and still very proud of is that all 30 of my scouts came home, and not one of them over those 15 months raised their weapon in anger. That's only one platoon, obviously, but part of being a human being on this earth is affecting what you can affect, right? So came home. My first book kind of arose out of that blog, and it had a very tenuous feel to it, right? Could this kind of, not peace, but at least a calm and stability that Iraq found itself in after the surge, could that last? We all know the answer to that now. It didn't take long, actually, for that answer to be found. 2011. American forces withdrew. I was now here in New York. I was trying to become a writer. I'd gone back to graduate school for writing. And I was deeply aware that serious uppercase writers, like the kind that I aspired to be, didn't write about war again. You can write about war once, but the kind of writer that I wanted to be in all my plans did something else. That said, this is when American forces are withdrawing from the country. I'd spent a formative time in my life there. Many people that I cared about, American and Iraqi, had given their lives to that place and to that war. So, for very understandable reasons, I would write during the day about anything everything not to do with the military or the army or Iraq or war. And then I'd spend all night watching the news, hoping, praying that some kind of calm and stability could endure. So I made a bargain with myself and said I could write one short story about it, since I was being drawn to it, but it couldn't be set when I was there. That was very important. The characters couldn't be viewing the war through the prism of me or someone like me. Of course, Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men, that 30-page short story, turned into a 300-page novel called Youngblood, which came out last year. And looking back on it now, as I wrote those two books, I don't even know if I was aware of it, but the first one, I realized I was making sense of our tour and our small place in this war in that time in late 2000 and 2007, late 2007 and 2008, trying desperately to push, to help push a country back from the brink of civil war. A civil war that my military very much helped initiate. Youngblood, the novel, was my attempt as a veteran, as a thinker, as just hopefully somebody trying to be an engaged citizen with these subjects, trying to make sense of the war as a whole, at least the war from 2003 to 2011. It's set a few years after I was there. It's set during that withdrawal, and many of the main characters are Iraqi, who are the ones who are going to be left to deal with the wreckage. So that came out last year, and that kind of led me to meeting and engaging these college students who've, when I was going through all that from 18 to 34, they were going from their nurseries to college, and this is the world we've given them, and it's hard not to arrive at a place of that we failed them, right? That we failed our young people by giving them this kind of forever war, but they also give me hope that they're going to be able to figure a way out of this in a way that we haven't been able to, that means kind of getting into the messy grays of existence, which I think all good literature, whether it's uppercase war literature or lowercase war literature or whatever, I think all good literature delves into those messy grays of existence and seeks common humanity. And if there's one thing that I think unifies the works of the authors up here, is that seeking. And the more readers who share in that with our stories, it's a force multiplier, and maybe we can do better, and maybe our young people will be able to give their children a slightly better, slightly more stable world.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that I hope will touch on everybody's points here, which you can pick up in your own way. But it's funny how many of you said things that I've said, and I'm sure I said that things you said, that we're all so much on the same page about a lot of things. But one of them is the Faulkner quote you used, Dalia, about the only thing worth writing is about the heart in conflict with itself, because I discovered that very early, and it became a sort of, in these books, when I was writing about this particular subject, it became a kind of mantra for me. So I wanted to ask you how you would describe your tackling of the heart in conflict with itself in your particular books that we're discussing today. Cara, you want to begin? And it does touch on all the points, I think, that you were all making, and Cara, in your case, the economic points and the fact that most people who die in wars today are not soldiers or even men, but women and children.
The heart in conflict with itself. So my novel, Be Safe, I Love You, is about a woman who decides, she lives in Watertown, New York, upstate New York, and her family is poor. Her father's had some mental health issues. He can't work. She has a younger brother who she's been raising pretty much on her own. Her mother left. And she was on track to get to have a music scholarship at Curtis, which is just a fantastic conservatory. But she decides that she needs to be the main breadwinner of her family, and so she enlists. And the story takes place when she's coming home, and she's kind of realized that maybe she didn't need to do that after all. Maybe she didn't need to take on all of those things after all. And I think the main conflict with this person, it's so much about what you were talking about imagination and creativity. This is a person who's literally made a choice to move away from their art, their calling, and to move towards being paid and having her family, her mortgage paid and all these things paid for by acts that she engages in, which end up, of course, in state-sanctioned murder because she's a soldier. So that is what drives the central conflict of that novel, and then how she reacts when she comes home and how she deals with those homecoming issues are the plot of the book, which you could read if you like. Yeah, I guess that's
good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but that's, and I think it's true that all, I would say that not just in, I won't talk about it because it's other books. I would say that all of my novels function around that same sort of thing. And I'm wondering, anybody remember, is it Nabokov who says that in order to create a character, you actually have to give them completely contradictory characteristics? Like, it's not, you don't have an interesting character unless they have things that really, like, fight each other.
Yeah.
Something's the same thing. Yeah.
David?
Well, then I must be an interesting character because my heart is always in conflict with it, so at least as far as the military is concerned. As I mentioned, I was in the Army for 20 years, and I was constantly fighting against being a soldier. In fact, in high school, I think I was voted most likely not to join the military, but I did anyways for various reasons, mainly financial and job stability. So, and I was just thinking as I was thinking back to way back to 1988, my pre-basic training days, I didn't know the first thing about the military. I didn't even know the difference between a lieutenant and a sergeant. One was an officer and one was enlisted. And I remember this is way before Google or even a personal computer, or the internet. But I remember doing research, what is an officer and what are these terms? And I tried to memorize all the ranks of the various, enlisted and officer before I got to basic training. But so I was always a soldier who was uncomfortable in his own skin. I went into the military thinking, I'm a writer, goddammit, I don't belong here. But yet, there I was. And then 17 years after joining the military, there I was in the sandbox, in an even more equally uncomfortable position. And I was constantly being disappointed by my leaders, and by leaders I mean those in the White House and the administration. As we learned, they to put it lightly, they prevaricated. And that directly affected me and the people I worked with as well. So, and that kind of bled over into my books, first Fobbit and then especially and now Brave Deeds. I had a really hard time not justifying what I did, but I felt uncomfortable doing some things, but yet you do them because those are, you're following the orders of those who are over you, to include those in the White House at the time, and I had to march on. So I always had this yin and yang, this conflict within me, and it kind of bled out onto the page, hopefully in ways interesting and dramatic, I guess. But so that's how I dealt with it. I dealt with my uncomfortable skin by writing it down.
Yeah, so my novel is about a man who's wrongly imprisoned in Iran after the revolution. And so the obvious conflict is the revolution, this man and his captors. But the point is, as he's imprisoned, he sort of has to reckon with himself. And so it's not just his life that unravels, it's he himself that begins to unravel as he has to examine the choices he's made and what has led to his present situation. So, not to get into the book, but he also understands that he, among thousands and hundreds of thousands of others, look the other way, and one thing has led to the other. And so it's the personal choices that people make that lead to the collective. And so he constantly has to reckon with the compromises he's made as he has grown older and middle-aged and veered from his ideals of his youth.
David, listening to you talk, I too fashioned myself the kind of person that wasn't supposed to join the military, and it wasn't until after I was in the Army that I realized that that's an archetype of people that join the Army, and it's been that way for hundreds and hundreds of years. And for good and bad, most of my best soldiers were types that didn't fit the part, and many of my worst soldiers were the guys that had wanted to be soldiers since they were 4 and just took it a little too seriously. Human heart in conflict with itself. Youngblood has 3 primary characters. It's narrated by a young lieutenant named Jack Porter, who's meant to serve kind of as a cipher for the reader. It's his first tour. He has a heroic older brother that was awarded a Silver Star for a previous tour, and he's boyish and earnest and clumsy and kind of boring, but I learned to love him despite resenting him and his choices as I wrote him. Rana is a local Iraqi woman, mother of 2, a daughter of a prominent sheikh who, over the course of the Iraq War, went from kind of living a relatively privileged life, at least for this village in Iraq, to kind of having it all taken away from her. She's very much a survivor. She may or may not have had a romance some years before with an Arab American soldier. She is not above using the foolish idealism of the American soldiers that she's encountered over 8 years to get her and her boys out of that country. And then the last character is kind of the antagonist, but I think some readers may find him to be more of an anti-hero. Staff Sergeant Daniel Chambers, who's a survivor himself, and at first maybe kind of comes across like Tom Berenger from Platoon, speaking of archetypes, but he has his reasons for why he does what he does. For him, all that matters is getting his soldiers home. And if I were a parent of one of those young privates, what more would I want from his or her platoon sergeant than somebody who says all that matters is they'll come home to you? But what does that mean? That's going to come with a lot of compromises and consequences, particularly when much of the larger mission is protecting this Iraqi town and these Iraqi townspeople. So, as I wrote that book, I certainly kept that Faulkner quote in mind and placed all 3 of those characters' inner desires and ideals in conflict with each other. And then once they started to figure out within themselves, put them in conflict with the other central characters.
Thank you. I'm thinking about how, in many ways, war stories are always about a heart in conflict with itself, not only on the level of the individuals in our stories, but on the level of the nation, especially when the war in question is one that has been so dodgy to begin with. So much of this country knew that and was against the war, although we forget that now, but it was true. So what I started to see in my interviews, when I started to see this conflict personified in the the wrangle, the struggle of individual veterans with their own consciences. Why did I allow myself, not for all of them, of course, but I met so many who feel this way. Why did I allow myself to be used in this fight that I now realize is wrong? How can I ever feel like a good person again? And I think that level metaphorically works for all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be about war, and I think that's one of the most essential questions that we tackle as human beings. If we've done something wrong, how do we feel like good people again? Almost all the veterans I've met wanted to be good people in the first place, were young and idealistic, if ill-informed. So that's another level. So now that I'm going to segue into that's very much what I write about, that conflict. But, and also from the point of view of Iraqis, how to live with the enemy, how to live in that displaced way that you mentioned, Dalia, when everything's been taken away from you and finding yourself dependent on the very country that did that to you. That's another kind of conflict that fascinates me, that I deal with. But since we all began writing our books, Trump has been elected. And I'm wondering what you would have to say about, do you think the meaning of your book has been changed by this? And do you think that your writing will be changed, in your future writing will be changed in some way by this? Speaking of conflicts in the human heart and in the nation.
Oh, man.
I know it's a big question.
Feel free to go first, yeah.
You don't have to. You can go in any order you want.
Anybody have thoughts on this?
I don't know about as far as the audience or readers or me approaching my novels differently since T. Rump has been in office, but just me as a writer, not even as a writer, as a person, I'm woke now. I'm more politically aware. I was, obviously I voted and read the headlines and all of that, but I haven't felt so much volcanic rage rising up inside of me as I have since November 8th. And I think that's going to spill over into whatever I write in the future. That being said, my next novel I'm planning is kind of like a screwball comedy set in Hollywood in 1940, so I don't know if I can manage to weasel Mr. T. Rump into that or not, but it's definitely going to inform all of us, not just at this table, but and not just writers, but every single fucking person in this nation is affected by last November 8th. And anyways, that's the volcano bubbling up, and I don't want to spill over too hot and burn you all with my lava.
That screwball comedy idea is great, though, because that's what we need.
Well, that's probably what I need as a relief.
Yeah.
And, I will say this, right, just briefly, and representing my publishers in the room, so I don't want her to get too cross-eyed about this. But what was it? November 10th or 11th, I went into the bedroom and I started writing notes for a new novel, and it was going to be set in 2020 at the next election, and it was trying to get all my feelings out on page that I was feeling at the time, and I ultimately set it aside. I don't want to say gave it up, but I set it aside for a variety of reasons. But I just thought it would be too topical and too timely and too on the nose. But there's going to be something in some way come out of it in the future. So stay tuned.
So I don't think the election of Trump is going to affect my writing so much. I think that my novels already dealt with issues that were pretty dark and. Yeah. Having to do with violence against women, and so I have anarchist politics. I'm not really, though I did vote. Don't think I didn't vote in this election. So the work that I generate, I don't think is going to change too much. But I do think that as a person, my sense of, even my cynical sense. Of my place in the world, I think, was deeply shaken by that election. For me, it really was around the issues of the rollback of women's position in society, which I have to say I think it's maybe had the opposite effect. I think it's really energized people, and I think the thing that we're seeing now, the enormous reaction of women like coming forward and talking about all these things is actually a reaction from Trump. So the things that I was thinking were just absolutely catastrophic. Some of them, and just even hearing, David talk about like being in a rage and going to those very first demonstrations after he was elected and seeing like on the front of the barricades there were these young women who were probably the kind of women you were seeing in classes when you went to talk to them, like 18-year-olds. I have never seen an 18-year-old NYU student with like pink like written on the butt of her sweatpants, like be like ready to fucking tear down a barricade and screaming and telling the boy next to her to shut the fuck up. Like we were like, oh, this is good news. So I do think that there's something bubbling here that's good, and I'm hoping that it brings us all together more, and maybe in the sense of writers having a community and understanding. This is always a problem in the anarchist community. Like you fight over tiny little things and tiny little differences, and I think people get it now. Like we don't have tiny little differences to fight over now. Like we need to be together on this thing. So maybe there's a little hope. Weird that I would say that, but maybe.
2 days after the election, I gave a speech at George Washington, and a number of the attendees were ROTC cadets. And 2 days after, it was a lot like, down in a college campus in DC, it was a lot like 2 days here in New York. People were still walking around crying openly, like, just dazed. And afterwards, I talked to some of the cadets, and they were very open and frank and asked me point blank, if you were in our shoes, what would you do? Because until the beginning of your senior year, you're really not. There's ways you have to pay back the military if they paid for those years of school, but you can kind of work your way out of that commitment. It was tough. It was tough, and you're on the spot, right? But I had to answer honestly and said, well, now more than ever, I think we need young military officers from places like George Washington. Because if we, the military needs to be as apolitical as possible. It needs thinking people who have read the right books, who have studied the histories, who know better, who, when put in these positions of great tumult, can make the right decision in 10 seconds or less, right? And have been prepared and steeled for that moment. That said, if I were their father, I'd probably be having a different conversation with them, and I told them that too. But I believe very strongly that now more than ever we can't be turning over our military, both enlisted and the officers, to a certain type of demographic or a certain type of politics or a certain type of background. As much as possible, the citizen soldier tradition of the American military needs to somehow endure in the face of all this. As for how it's all affected my writing, I agree with a lot of what's already been said. Kind of a fight. It's been a very difficult reminder that politics is a fight, right? And that history is a fight, right? And we can't get lazy, and we're not beyond these very basic things that we things like nativism, things like tribalism. The American Republic is itself still very much an experiment, and we can't rest on our laurels, and it's up to every one of us as citizens to push back against that. And I'm writing a novel that's an alternative history set in a world where America won Vietnam, and it's been a daily struggle not to let the headlines of the moment creep into that narrative. But have I borrowed a couple of them here and there? Sure.
And Dalia, I mean, your country has been more demonized than ever.
I guess I'll just add that I feel that the sense of displacement is even greater because everything is so unsettling and surreal for everybody, but especially for somebody who comes from elsewhere.
Yeah.
In terms of the writing, I constantly I feel activism can be a dangerous thing in the writing, so I constantly feel a need to restrain myself, and that raw anger maybe shouldn't be on the page. And in terms of Iran itself, I'll just say that they now look like the rational guys at the table, so, you know,
Yeah.
that's that.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to take some questions from everyone, or anyone, if you'd like to have anything to ask. Yes.
A question for David. On the craft issue, I'm wondering whether there was a time ever while you were working on it that you doubted the wisdom of doing the group narrative, and whether did you experiment or change it at all while you were doing it, or just push ahead with it?
Yeah, I had probably a couple of early twinges of doubt, and even more so on that moment when you press send to your agent and your editor. It's like, are they going to like it, or are they going to make me completely rework the novel? But yeah, I just forged ahead with it. Yeah, I felt confident in it, and hoped that others, especially those first lines of my editor and my agent, would also agree. So, and once it got out of the gate, then the readers could make of it what they would.
I also do my best editing after hitting send.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could the two gentlemen speak to what you had said, Cara, which was the critique of
Their work.
of the soldierly novel, and how your understanding of your own work fits or doesn't, or is like that critique or a little bit different from that critique?
Ooh, I don't know. Like I said, I always felt like an outsider, both in the military and then I don't know. It's weird to talk about your own work, I guess, in a way, but a feeling like I wanted to go a little bit against the grain, both in the narrative structure, both Fobbit and Brave Deeds, and not make it. I don't want people to think of this as a war novel. A lot of people, hear that term, especially those who have a preconception of, the bullets and the bravery and the heroism and just all the stereotypical things you think about when it comes to war and culture. And I would hope that they just see this as a book about people who happen to be overseas fighting a war.
I do want to add, that my comments, that David's work particularly, especially Fobbit, which is a novel that I think is just amazing. And when I was reading it, I was feeling like this is somebody has found a way to write Catch-22 again, which is really what, if there's going to be war writing, in my opinion, that's the goal. And when I read, I remember distinctly reading Fobbit. I remember tearing through it and how much I loved it. And so these statements are certainly not personal attacks on my fellow panelists here in any way, but I do feel that they have to be said, particularly because this idea that the heroic narrative is the one that is going to be steamrolled over all of us, regardless of what our experience is. That needs to be deeply questioned, and I'm happy to see women deeply questioning that narrative in all aspects of public life, and it absolutely has to happen in this one too. So I want to say that before Matt, you have something to say.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One, we're all writing from the shoulders of the giants that came before us, right? And it's responding to whether out of respect or out of defiance and rage. Why write? And it's a question I thought about as I wrote Youngblood. the Iliad's really good. What more, you know, why even bother? Because it's an ongoing conversation, right? And I think literature, at least I find great strength in viewing it that way, that we're all kind of responding to and learning from each other. You know, even, you know, kind of on a micro level, right? Look at American war literature from the World War II on, right? Nobody, I think, had more effect on the literature that's been, the veteran literature at least, that's been emerging from Iraq and Afghanistan than, say, Tim O'Brien. But Tim O'Brien, who I think is brilliant, and his works are literally on my top shelf, he was a draftee from Minnesota, right? Their war, they didn't really interact with too many local Vietnamese, at least the way that we did in our wars. So those two things right there, an all-volunteer force versus a draftee and interacting with the local population, completely different, right? And I you know, I'm biased obviously, but I think that deserves to be explored seriously and thoroughly in literature. And I think literature is uniquely qualified to explore those complications and those nuances. I also totally agree that kind of pushing back and defying kind of the easy hero narrative is vital, and I think literature is supremely qualified to do that. You know, with Veterans Day, just a couple days ago, I came across an old article about Pat Tillman, right? And I think that's a kind of a perfect example of you know, after he was killed and the powers that be wanted to present that easy, brave narrative. Literally, even awarded him a Silver Star when it took, you know, and it took the digging of some intrepid journalists, and it took some soldiers who were there willing to speak out and say, no, that's not what happened. He was killed in friendly fire. And it doesn't change who he was as a person, but it absolutely changes the narrative that is now trying to be sold for political reasons. And you know, that's kind of the news version of what I think literature, good war literature, can also do, which is push back and say, that's not what happened. It's much more complicated and devastating and maybe even interesting than that. Sit down with me for a couple pages and hopefully you agree.
Thank you for answering the question, what makes a soldier qualified to be a war writer? I really appreciate that. I mean, I'm quite serious. Like, I have wondered for a long time, like, what's the significance of having people who are so embedded in that whole process? What gives them, like, the right to write about it? And I think your answer, which is that, like, literature can actually tackle these things, is a very good answer.
Well, you know, and journalists or civilians who have survived the ravages, those stories need to be out there too.
Yeah.
It is unfortunate, kind of in contemporary American culture, it seems like an either or, and it absolutely can't be if we're going to tackle these subjects seriously. All these voices need to be heard equally at the table if we're actually going to, you know, learn anything from the past 17 years.
Yeah.
I would say I think we probably all resist the label war writers about our work anyway, as David said, because we are writing about human beings and profound moral conflicts that, you know, that and sometimes the war is in it and sometimes it isn't. And we've also, you know, I've written and Cara's written certainly other books that have nothing to do with this. But that picks up on what I was saying in my piece about the importance of literature to go into all the complications and the nuances, and, you know, and to open up people who are normally labeled the other, to make us able to cross into them. And that's, in a way, especially essential when you're writing about war, because one of the first things that's done is to demonize the other and dehumanize them. So we need to always push back against that. You had a question.
Yeah, so Matt, for your book, you said you have some Iraqi characters. How did you write these characters? As the American soldier looking at them, or did you actually do some research to know what they were thinking, how they really felt?
I did a lot of research. I certainly had a lot of my own experiences, but early in drafting the novel, I realized all my memories were A, distorted by a couple years, and B, you know, it didn't matter how friendly or baby-faced I was trying to come across. I was a foreign army officer with a gun in their living room, right? There was only so much candor, even an acquaintance, a friendly acquaintance, would be willing to give someone like me under those conditions. So some of the most helpful research I came across were oral histories, particularly a book called Voices from Iraq, that is unfiltered and unvarnished, and I learned a lot more. I learned a lot more about the war that I inherited in late 2007 by reading these oral histories, and as a veteran of that war, it was dark reading. It was sometimes tough to take and to think about being proud, reconciling my pride of what my 30-man platoon had accomplished and we had, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to this larger devastation. But as a writer, it was so invaluable, and in learning to give these characters as a full dimensionality, and not treating them as stock characters who are all good or all evil or anything, that they whether it's showing up actually in the text or not, it's in the subtext, that they're living full lives, trying to survive this, trying to endure this. There's another character, Iraqi character in the book, is a 12-year-old adolescent Iraqi boy, and all he knows, I talked earlier about American college students, all they know is a war from afar. Well, all this young man knows is a war in his backyard, and how would that shape his psyche? How would that shape his worldview? How would that shape his interactions with other Iraqis, let alone the American soldiers that cycle in and out every year? And so it was just a lot of revision and a lot of research, and then also sharing it with friends of mine who have Middle Eastern backgrounds, and being like, does this sound like an Iraqi character, or does this sound like a stupid white author trying to develop an Iraqi character, and not taking it personally when they said the latter, and being like, okay, help me get better, because I think this character deserves it.
Actually, I think that, as far as I know, Matt and I are the only American authors who've written from the point of view of Iraqi women. And there aren't that many novels that have come out of this war yet that depict Iraqis at all as full human beings. There are a few, but shockingly few. But I think we're the only ones who paid attention to the women at all.
I didn't write from her perspective, just to that was a bridge too far for me, at least. But
she's a full cat,
yes.
Right? Whereas I do write from the Iraqi perspective in mine, and I spent a long time interviewing Iraqi refugees around Albany. There are around 400 people who've been enlisted, who've been settled there, as well as some of my students were former interpreters, and they were all amazingly helpful. But yes, one has to really work at if one is going to cross a culture like that. But that's part of what we should do anyway as writers. Anyone else? We almost done? So we're out of time. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.